Pryor. I'm a prevention education specialist from the Crime Victim Center. I am joined by one of my counselors and colleagues from the Crime Victim Center. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
My name is Leslie Wagner. I am one of the counselors from the Crime Victim Center.
And basically the reason why we're here today and why we're doing what will be an audio, I guess you could call it a podcast or a session, is basically like many people in this country, we found ourselves kind of working from home and under the quarantine, the self-isolation, whatever you want to call it. But because of that, you find yourself just trying to do what you can to occupy your time in between the work hours and everything. And myself and Leslie, like many people in this country, if the ratings and the Facebook comments and the Instagram and the Snapchat and the memes and the GIFs or GIFs or whatever you want to call them are any indication, we, like many of you, wound up watching the documentary Tiger King. Now, Leslie and I have a unique kind of perspective that we were able to garner from the show, in that working at the Crime Victim Center, which is, a nonprofit victimization counseling and assistance organization, we sort of saw some aspects and perspectives and things that came up from the course of the documentary that I don't think the average person might have noticed, or it didn't, hit their radar or they picked up on. And we decided we really want to just take some time to just kind of talk about this. Is going to be episodes 1 and 2, and from sort of a prevention, a counseling, victimization organization standpoint, just maybe bringing your attention to some things you might not have noticed or just didn't register with you. So with that, I'm just going to tell you there's obviously going to be spoilers. This is not really designed to be a setup for anyone who hasn't watched the episode. So obviously I would recommend you watch episodes 1 and 2 before you listen to this. With that having been said, I also think that just the nature of the documentary, and we'll get into this, there's not really a whole lot in the way of what you would call spoilers, because within the first few minutes of the documentary, you know how the story of the quote main character Joe Exotic has ended, or where it is, at least nowadays. But without that, let's just get into it. And Leslie, from a counseling standpoint, working at a victimization center and working as a counselor with people who are victims of various crimes, unhealthy relationships, abusive relationships, what were some of the things in the first couple episodes that kind of stuck out with you?
Addiction, domestic violence or domestic issues, stalking within relationships, obsessions with others, the LGBTQ relationships, how the individuals that were in Tiger King were not 100% sure that they were part of the LGBTQ community, but they were kind of introduced to it because the main character, Joe Exotic, kind of flourished them into this relationship at a very early age with the two individuals that he became involved with. There was a lot of hoarding, and hoarding goes with a lot of victimization. People have to have security with their items, and that a lot of it, hoarding, is caused from trauma in their life. In Joe's case, in the Tiger King, he more or less was hoarding his tigers, and it became disruptive in his life as you start watching the show a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Narcissism, we see that a lot in the center. People come in and they're trying to get out of relationships, and their partner is very narcissistic towards them. Kind of revenge on others. And people are in a relationship, in a terrible relationship, that one partner is always trying to seek revenge onto the other. Mm-hmm. And that person that is trying to better themselves, they can't seem to move forward because you always have that other person doing something behind the scenes,
Right.
whether stalking them or, you know, making fake cell phone numbers, you know, constantly harassing them on social media. So there's that always that revenge there going on.
Mhm. So just to kind of take what we have right now and just sort of kind of fill in some of the gaps and some of the blanks, even if you watch the show, we want to make sure that we kind of just get all the characters and all the players clear. The main person, obviously the focal point of the documentary, The Tiger King, is a gentleman who calls himself Joe Exotic. His last name, he even admits his true birth last name is very difficult to pronounce. As I understand it, is Shrevogel, but he calls himself Joe Maldonado Passage, which is a hyphenation of the two gentlemen you were alluding to, that he winds up basically marrying. He enters into a marriage type relationship with. These are two characters or two people that Travis Maldonado, and then I believe it's Dylan Passage. But before that, even he's in a threesome with. Now, wait a minute. I think I already got this confused. So,
John
yeah,
and
yeah, John Finley and Travis Maldonado make up what is sort of a throuple, this three-person relationship that you see in the first two episodes that Joe Exotic has. And as you mentioned, it's alluded to in the first two episodes, and they really kind of pull it out further in the other episodes. But both Travis and John don't really seem to identify themselves as much as what we would call homosexual or LGBTQ as Joe does. Joe clearly identifies himself as homosexual, and he indicates that he knew that from the age of 13. And as you mentioned, that hoarding and stuff, and that kind of the mental health aspect with the obsession sort of started coming around then, because as he even recognized, his environment, his community, his family life growing up, very difficult, if not impossible, to truly identify and know yourself as homosexual or LGBTQ and be able to be comfortable and be able to be open about that. And that's where you start seeing that bit of obsession come through. So that's Joe Exotic. Now, the Maldonado Passage, the last name he goes by now, that has to do with a gentleman named Dylan who comes up later in the show. So we'll talk about him. But one of the things I found interesting talking about, and maybe you can give me your opinion on this when we talk about maybe imbalances in relationships and the idea of possible manipulation. You talked about things like narcissism and the unhealthiness of relationships. The scene in either the first or the second episode where it shows when Joe is marrying or when he's entering into his relationship with Travis and John, and the scene is kissing after the I do's and everything. Did you notice what I noticed about that?
I noticed that they were both uncomfortable about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like they just were there.
Yeah.
That there was no feeling there in that relationship.
And that's exactly what I noticed too. Again, talking about unhealthy relationships and the little warning signs or stuff we see, the idea is that the image that is trying to be brought out, the ideal situation is, okay, let's say, okay, all three of the parties in this relationship identify equally, they feel equally among each other, then there should be equal emotions and feelings shown. And what happens is
Right.
Joe at the end, he kisses John and he kisses Travis, but Travis and John do not interact with each other emotionally or physically at all.
Right, I noticed that.
They are essentially players in the relationship of Joe's life. They're connected to each other through Joe, as opposed to them equally having a connection to each other. I found that one of the other things that you kind of see when you look at Joe is the show itself is trying to, I keep calling it the show, the documentary is the idea of here you're going to learn about this guy who loves tigers, his, if from our perspective, it certainly manifests as like an obsession, almost like a borderline hoarding, but somehow, even if you want to say he's turned it into, do what you love and do what you're obsessed with, and make it something that you can get paid for or whatever, which he does. Obviously, that's how the documentary wound up or whatever. But even
Right.
from the beginning, did you notice that the tigers, it's all about him? He talks about the stage is him, and that he loves the fact that he gets to be on these stage and all these people show up and they get to see him, and he has these 500-pound cats around him. How did you feel about that aspect of it?
He wants the attention on himself, and that's where the narcissistic attitude comes from him. Look at me, look at me, look what the wonderful things that I'm doing. I'm bringing these cats to these people. We're having petting time. Look at me, look at me. And he wants that full attention onto him. And that's the way a lot of people are when they're in a bad relationship. They want the attention brought onto them and make other people feel like they're the victim. And I think as the show goes on, he did that with Joe, or with Travis and John too. And unfortunately, certain things happened later on, and we'll get to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and they were in these relationships with Joe, and they started to realize, hey, I don't want to be in this relationship anymore. What do I need to do to get out?
Mm-hmm. And exactly, this is what I think. I know you read a lot of the comments and stuff about the show. People are going, well, you get into it and everything, and people forget that, the true victims. Because again, like with the documentary, and we'll get into this, every couple episodes, every couple scenes, whatever, you're wondering, as we're programmed to do when we watch things like this, who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Who am I supposed to connect with? Who am I supposed to like and not like? And I will say this, the documentarian does a really good job of trying to change those angles and those perspectives. You root for somebody in one moment, and by the end of the episode, you're going, wow, ooh, I don't know about them anymore. But one of the things that they showed, and I kind of recognized it, from what we do and what we work with, is you nailed it. The attitude that he has towards those cats, the idea that they're here for me. I'm the one on the stage. I'm the one that I'm all about. And that leads to exploitation. That leads to deficiency of care of these tigers, which a lot of people are very upset about. And, as an animal, I agree with them. But it's important to understand, as we recognize, he does that to human beings. He does
Right.
to John and Travis, and later I believe Dylan is his name. I apologize. I'll correct it if I'm wrong on the third gentleman. But those relationships, and you look at how he handles the cats in episodes 1 and 2, and there's kind of a heavy hand there for him. He's the main stage, and they're just the accessories and stuff. Look at how he interacts in their wedding, in their marriage ceremony, the music videos. Which I will try to, when I can. I'm not going to get too obsessed with trivia and everything, but I will kind of try to throw a little trivia out there just to maybe answer a few questions I think some people might have. But in case you were wondering, if you've watched episode 1 and 2, no, that is not Joe Exotic's real voice. He did not actually sing any of those songs. You can barely hear him singing underneath the vocals, but it is the Clinton Johnson band, apparently, is the actual band that you hear in the in the documentaries doing the music or whatever. But again,
I'm glad you clarified that.
Yeah. Well, I had to look it up and everything because obviously people were asking, but here's another perfect example. Unhealthy relationship, and show you the attitude Joe Exotic is. They've interviewed the people in this band after the show, and they were like, you know what? The whole time we were working with him, we thought it wasn't going to be like that. We thought actually we were just going to be like his band. And so we would be like background music when he was doing like shows and when he was doing his TV shows and everything. And lo and behold, he, as they called it, he Milli Vanilli'd it. He made it look like it was him doing that.
Right, right.
Again.
But if you remember correctly, he said, people are here at my zoo to watch me. They're not here for the tigers. They're here for me. That's classic narcissistic behavior right there.
Absolutely. And obviously, I don't think now. And then one of the reasons, again, we wanted to kind of do this discussion and bring this forward is that I don't know that a lot of people know a Joe Exotic, or as we'll get into in a moment here, a Doc Antle or a Carol Baskin. Those are the three main players. But I think all of us has experienced someone that has some of the characteristics, some of the attitudes and behaviors of these people that have led to unhealthy relationships. And we kind of get put in a situation. I know a lot of what I do when we do prevention education, and I know from a counseling standpoint as well, you want to help out people that are victims or that find themselves in these relationships, but we also want to help people that are sort of the bystanders and observe these relationships. What do we do when we see somebody treating somebody else like Joe does to John or Travis? Or what do we do when we see two people like Carol and Joe interacting with each other, or Doc and his whole connection? Like, how do we handle that? And so, yeah, we really need to examine these perspectives, because while we don't all know a Joe Exotic, we know people that have maybe fallen into very similar relationships as to the ones that are expressed.
And as a counseling perspective, we try and teach our clients the different behaviors that they're expressing to us about their partner, their ex-partner, on how manipulative they are, and trying to get them to recognize you don't need to be in this type of relationship with someone, because it's not a give and take relationship. It's give me, give me, give me. So in a counseling perspective, that is the main thing that we try and educate our clients to recognize these behaviors from their partners, whether they're in a male-female relationship, or if they're in a female-female or male-male relationship. It all connects together.
Yeah, and that's really what you see. And unfortunately, it just sort of expands and expands from that. These negatives, these what we call almost yellow flags, quickly become red flags, and things explode from there. But to just kind of keep everything in the flow, at least in the way it's presented in the episodes. Basically, episode 1, as we mentioned, introduces us to Joe Exotic, who creates this animal park in Oklahoma. And it also introduces us to, if you have your main character, if you have your protagonist, you have to have your antagonist. And we're introduced to Carol Baskin, who through the course of the episodes, through the course of the documentary, is presented, at least to us, the audience, as the for lack of a better word, the villain, the antagonist, the person that you're supposed to, at least in general, root against. She's someone who, just to give you just a brief little background synopsis, as I mentioned, Joe Exotic has the Greater Wynnewood Exotic Animal Park. Carol Baskin has Big Cat Rescue, and the documentary kind of shows that there is this separate world of cat collecting, big cat collecting, which one might argue that entire population sort of has aspects of maybe like the obsession, the hoarding of these cats. There's something about them that they just want to collect them and everything. And she is in a very fierce competitive rivalry. She portrays it as a moral or an ethical rivalry. One could say, depending on which side you fall on, you could see it as two business people competing against each other. If you see it on a moral, ethical perspective, one party or the other just feels the other one isn't as good of a person when it comes to loving or taking care of the cats. But ultimately, Carol Baskin in Tampa, Florida, she has her own rescue sanctuary and is devoting a good amount of her time not only to, quote, taking care of her cats and her animals, but trying to do what she can to get Joe Exotic shut down, as well as one of the other main characters that we're other main people that we're introduced to in this documentary, Doc Antle. So from a counseling perspective, since I think we've kind of, really summed up Joe Exotic pretty good, give me your opinions, your not your opinions, but your perspectives, I should say, your analysis from what you saw from a counseling standpoint on Carol, and we'll go into Doc as well.
With Carol, my view on is that she played the kind of the victim. Everybody feels sorry for me because Joe Exotic is constantly harassing me. In return, she was also harassing him back. You know, she starts a lawsuit. They start wars on social media. So they're antagonizing each other, going back and forth. She wants to play the victim. Joe wants to play the victim. And we see that a lot of times with clients also. You know, how can we, how do I say, educate these people on not playing the victim?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it can be difficult. And Carol, she has the money to play everything out the way that she wants it.
Mm-hmm.
And Joe is struggling with his zoo to pay his monthly bills.
Right.
You
And
know?
at the same time, now I see now when you use the term playing a victim, it's important to understand that like we're not trying to necessarily, you know, come down one side and the other or who's good or bad or whatever. But what is kind of clear, at least from, you know, analyzing the standpoint and everything, is from the documentary standpoint, at least in the first couple episodes, there is a level of manipulation that Carol even is engaged in. Now we mentioned that Joe, you know, he's manipulating sort of the zoo and everything and the animals and even his workers to do for him. It's all about me. And Carol is very similar, and she's presented in the documentary as very similar because she has her rescue.
Right. She's doing it in a different way where she's looking at it as, oh, I have all these volunteers helping my zoo. I have everybody color coordinated by their job duties and how long they've been here. But she'll also say, well, oh, you've been here for 5 years. I'm just now starting to realize who you are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these people put their heart and soul into volunteering for these cats, and she can't seem to recognize who they are, who her devoted workers are.
Mm-hmm.
And that says a lot about her, that she's all about getting her needs met.
Exactly. So while we are kind of set up because of the way, again, the way the documentary kind of plays out, we as the audience are introduced to sort of Joe first. You make the connection with Joe, the understanding of Joe. It explains that in the beginning, he at least states that one of the reasons why he created this zoo was because it was a thing that he and his brother wanted to have. His brother passed away, and so he does it in his memory. So again, you're making that connection, that sympathy and everything. You don't really get as much of an explanation, at least in the first 2 episodes, as to why Carol is doing what she's doing. So you aren't given the ability as a bystander, as a viewer, as an audience to understand where she's coming from as far as what she's doing. You only get an understanding of who she is, what she does, based on how it affects Joe. And because of that, you get this idea that here's this person, we don't really know who she is yet, we don't understand her, but she is trying to come after Joe. She's trying to get Joe shut down. She's saying these things about Joe. And at least in the first couple episodes, it really comes off from us, the viewer, us as the bystander, as almost being a hypocrite. Because as she says, this is a quote, I actually had to write this down because I couldn't believe it the first time I heard it. And this is another one that I think makes it on a lot of the memes and a lot of the GIFs and stuff like that. People like Joe Exotic are breeding cats for life in cages. The reason we have cats in cages is to provide them a safe place to live until they die. Well, if you don't know anything about big cat breeding, that literally reads like hypocrisy. You're just basically, what you just said is he's doing bad. We're doing the same thing, but it's good because you see how I changed the words? And
Right.
again, we don't all know a Joe Exotic. We don't all know a Carol Baskin. But I think we've all been in situations where we know someone that is part of a relationship or is part of maybe a relationship that has gone poorly. And the perspective we're getting on the other side, on the other party, is being manipulated and is being groomed by the person that's presenting it to us. The documentarian, I'm just going to say right now, we're going to obviously talk about the abusive relationships between all the characters that we see, the unhealthy relationships, the toxic behaviors that are brought up. I personally feel, and I know we talked before, you agree with me on this, we as the audience become part of the quote relationship that's going on here. And we are getting manipulated. We are being sort of gaslit.
Sucked in. Yeah, we're being sucked into this relationship, this documentary.
Mm-hmm. And this is what happens with, I think, people when you meet somebody in a relationship. If you know one person in that relationship beforehand, your observation as a bystander to that relationship is going to kind of be controlled by the person you're connected with. So if we knew Joe before we know Carol, Carol's going to be whoever she is to us by how we know Joe. And the documentarian, at least in the first 2 episodes, is going to be like, look, this is who you're watching. This is who I want you to at least understand and connect with, Joe. This is who Carol is. And she does have money in that. So this is getting back to the idea when you said playing the victim. In the first 2 episodes, that's what it feels like, because Joe clearly does some
unusual things to catch her.
unusual, criminal, what I would consider, I'll get into, at least when we wrap up this first one, the idea of, I want to kind of try to make clear, one of the goals I have is to try to make clear the idea of what we mean when we talk about like toxic masculinity. And I think a lot of people don't understand when we talk about toxic masculinity that it has a lot of varying degrees to it and everything. And Joe Exotic, even being homosexual, manifests and engages in some very toxic masculine behavior. And one of the clear ones that comes out is once Carol Baskin tries to shut him down, he takes a very toxic masculine approach, which is shoot to kill. And I am not being figurative about that.
Right.
The beginning of the first episode to the end of the first episode and into the second episode, for those of you who don't know, big spoiler alert, he goes to jail for trying to hire somebody to murder Carol Baskin, as well as they get into the legal aspects of cruelty to animals and captivity and Endangered Species Act, and he violates that as well, and that gets tacked onto his criminal charges. But basically, once he gets into this rivalry and this unhealthy, if you want to call it like a relationship, this connection with Carol, he is out to absolutely destroy her, to the point that he is loading dynamite into dummies and blowing them away and pretending they're Carol. And Carol is sitting there going, this guy is trying to kill me. This guy is trying to kill me. And anybody in that situation, if it's not done through the documentary perspective, would absolutely go, wow, Joe needs to be locked up. That's serious. But
right. And those are some of the things that we see when we see clients that are coming from domestic issues. They'll come to us and say, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, or whomever is trying to kill me. They've made threats to me. And that's clearly what Joe has done to Carol in these first couple episodes. And he's broadcasted it on social media.
And in case you're wondering about if it will die down and smooth out over the next 7 episodes, don't hold your breath. Obviously, I mean, he's in jail. It doesn't die down. But I think we get pulled in again. If you knew somebody very similar to Joe, or even it could even be a female person, but they're going to give you their perspective on the other person in the relationship or in the interaction. So since we're kind of getting Joe's story told to us, of course she's horrible. Of course she's playing the victim. But getting into some of the other episodes, I'll try to explain a little bit what I can, but I don't want to wind up, we don't have enough time to go through all 7 episodes at once here. They
Right.
do later on kind of explain some of the life story of Carol before she became involved in Joe Exotic's life and everything. But until we have that, she's really just another aspect to Joe's life. And she's seen as somebody who is using her money, using her influence, using the things that Joe doesn't have to try to go after Joe and get Joe shut down. But then when Joe tries to stick up for himself, I don't have the money, I can't go to the courts, I can't go through the legal systems and get laws passed, but you know what, I got this TV show and I can use my freedom of speech and I can get the people to understand my perspective. And then when you don't like that, you try to turn around and play the victim. That's the attitude and the perspective we're presented as the viewers. And I think a lot of people, when you see a relationship and you all of a sudden realize, oh my God, it's gone unhealthy, it went bad, and you go, why didn't I say or do something? It's because you were being groomed as well as the person in the unhealthy relationship. You were being
Right.
made to feel that Joe was right and Carol was wrong, or vice versa.
Right. And as we go through the other episodes, we're going to see more of Carol's behavior and how she continues to manipulate the audience on feel sorry for me, feel sorry for me. And Joe, he just keeps trugging along like, I want my zoo to run, and this Carol Baskin woman keeps ruining it for me. So there's that continuous battle between the both of them. They're always after each other.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to watch that.
And it's also interesting to note there's a point where you are first getting ready to meet Carol Baskin. So basically the way we as the audience, we as the bystanders learn about Carol Baskins is Joe talking about Carol Baskin. Then the video kind of shows us Carol Baskin, documentarian goes to meet Carol Baskin. And he even says, oh my goodness, she's dressed perfectly. And she's dressed in what I think most people would consider a very kind of
hippie style.
Hippie, thank you. We
Yeah.
didn't even talk about this, and you called it hippie too. So I think most people are going to make that level of connection. But I think most people's attitude and kind of the default programming perspective we're given is you don't take people necessarily seriously like that.
Mm-hmm.
You're seen as kind of flighty. And I'm going to be honest with you. I was looking with my wife as we were, my wife Amy, as we were watching the documentary the first time. I was kind of watching the way the things were shot and filmed, and she is almost always filmed in slow motion, and it's usually when she's laughing or giggling, and you cannot look cool, you cannot look sympathetic, you cannot look serious or important if you're laughing and you're kind of being floaty and what we would call a hippie-ish in slow motion. She's on that big wheeled kind of bike, and even as bicycling on a big bike like that in slow motion looks very rocking and swaying, and she just looks flighty. She looks not serious.
Right.
And then
you have to pay attention to the body language when it comes to people. A big thing when you're trying to understand what they're trying to portray to you. Are they looking you directly in the eye? Are they blinking a lot? Are they moving their upper body a lot? So we can dissect Carol all day long. I'm on watching all the episodes, but you have to understand what she's trying to do, and she's, like I said before, she's manipulating the audience.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you see that sometimes. It can be a difficult thing. I imagine from a counseling side and everything, you're trying to do what you can for that victim when they're getting out of an abusive or an unhealthy relationship. But you also probably have to really toe that line and really, balance out, making sure that they don't let themselves almost manipulate themselves into something unhealthy. And you can almost see, and the later episodes will sort of show it, the nature of some things that happened to Carol put her in a situation where she actually is, one could with, I shouldn't say one could, she is absolutely a victim of some abusive relationships.
Right, right. And she talks about her previous marriage and forth. Um, I can't remember if it was in episode 2 or 3, but
Mhm.
either, she talks about her past relationships. Um, but it's still, it goes back how she portrays herself to the
Yeah.
audience, you know?
Well, and that's like I said, I would think, a lot of the concern is if you're trying to build somebody back up after being out of an abusive relationship, you want to make sure that they don't wind up, because good things start, what I guess for lack of a better term, good things or healthy things start happening. They start recovering, they start rebuilding, they start making themselves feel better and making themselves whole, and they start giving themselves power and control back because they've identified themselves as, okay, you know what, this was an abusive, this was an unhealthy situation, I was a victim, I'm going to take control and I'm going to get it back. Well, you want to also make sure that they don't connect being a victim with being good. And this is where I think you were getting with the idea of going, well, then you start trying to put yourselves into situations or trying to create the situation where, okay, well, I'm the victim, how am I going to get control, how am I going to have health or growth in this situation? Well, I'll make it so that I'm the victim, so that people will sympathize with me. That's not necessarily a healthy way to go. And
Right,
certainly
right.
and it'll become a little clearer if you understand this and you sort of see it from this perspective. I'm not encouraging one way or the other people to sympathize for one person or another, but you start to understand them a bit better. And I think
Mhm.
so it's 1 and 2, you get a particular perspective of Carol that once you understand some other things about her, as you mentioned, like her previous marriage, um, which I think they really get into in episode 3. Uh,
Yeah.
you get a better understanding of where this idea of her kind of defaulting to, wait a minute, I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm the victim in this situation, where that kind of came from. But episode 2 really tries to bring out the other people and the other workers and the relationships in this. And so starting with episode 2, I thought there was something very telling about Joe Exotic and the way he runs his workplace. And again, relationships are not just like spousal relationships or family or romantic relationships. A lot of victimization can occur in unhealthy workplace things, when you see things like sexual harassment or work power dynamics that are being abused. And those can be just as unhealthy, and those can be just as dangerous for people's mental health and well-being. Episode 2 begins with a voiceover. It's an audio of a 911 call when one of the characters, Saf, has their arm ripped off by one of the tigers. And there's something very telling. Tell me what you felt as a counselor from the way Joe reacted to that incident.
Um, I looked at it as he felt like his zoo was going to fail right there. One of his workers got hurt. He felt that his worker that got the arm taken off by the tiger was going to sue him. And having a risky business like that he had, I could relate to that. You have these 900-pound cats, and at any moment they could take an arm or a leg off or whatever, and that's the risk you take. But like you said, working with different relationships, workplace relationships, he was, I think in his mind, he thought he was doing the good thing by helping these individuals that were coming out of prison, that were looking for work. Hey, I have a job for you. The economy's bad, whatever. You're looking for a place to live, whatever. I think in Joe's mind, he thought that he was doing good for them. And
Absolutely.
and, and it comes out that some of his workers were like very grateful for him for giving them a job, because they needed that coming right out of jail. But at one point, where did the manipulation start? At the very beginning of their introduction of their relationships? Absolutely, because
Mhm.
Joe was looking for more people to run his zoo. That was his main motive.
Yeah. So once again, just to kind of sum it up here. So, and again, talking about identity and the LGBTQ community, the person, the keeper of the tigers that gets their arm ripped off is named Saf. And we'll get into the dynamics of Saf when it comes into the LGBTQ community and everything. But Saf has his arm basically ripped off for the most part. The scene shows Joe immediately gets the belt on, does whatever he can to take care of Saf's arm, goes into essentially the gift shop, the waiting area of his,
Right.
announces, he says, listen, before the news gets this, I will tell you what happened so I can give you a refund or we can do a rain check, whatever you want. He sorts out that situation. It goes a little bit later and it shows him off to the side. And this again, talking about the mentality of where Joe's coming from. In that moment of, oh my God, and everything he saw, and you watching the show, if you see it for the first time, you're like, what? And you're reacting very viscerally. His are, oh my God, I'm never going to financially recover from this. So
Right.
this,
I think when he went into the gift shop and told those customers, hey, one of our workers got their arm taken off, I think he could have approached that a little differently. He could have said, there was an accident out in the cages. I can give everybody a rain check. I don't think he needed to like exploit exactly what had happened to one of his workers.
Mm-hmm.
The news was going to do that anyways.
Yeah. And just the idea of is he going to be okay? Oh my God, are the rest of my workers safe? Do I need to look at, safety precautions for what, could this happen to a visitor or whatever? It is, I, Joe Exotic, am going to be hurt by this. This is going to affect me. This is going to hurt me. I'm never going to financially recover from this. And as you're going to see, that sets up in the beginning when we reveal towards the end of the second episode that, as you mentioned, there's these $1 million lawsuits that are being brought by Carol Baskin against Joe. You as a bystander, you as the audience are being seen, wow, Joe didn't do anything wrong. This person was attacked in what they consider in their world a freak accident. He's going to be hurt by this. This is going to affect him. And now here comes Carol over the top with these lawsuits because he's joking around and threatening her and everything. That's what you're meant to feel as an audience member. But one of the main, and the second episode is even called Cult of Personality. So I think as we're going to wrap up, just kind of talking about episode 2 to sort of set up for, hopefully ideally the rest of the recordings we do here. What did you feel about the idea? Okay, the second episode is called Cult of Personality. What do we learn about Joe and the way he runs his zoo, about Carol, the way she runs her zoo? And then let's talk briefly also about this gentleman who identifies himself as Mahamayavi Bhagavan, quotation marks, Doc Antle.
But they also use the term my lord.
Yeah. Well, Bhagavan,
my lord.
Yeah, when they call him Bhagavan, Bhagavan means Lord. And
right.
what you get from this is, and again, as we as bystanders, we are viewers of this relationship and the dynamics of these people, you're given the idea that he kind of runs a very Maharaja, very spiritual sort of like cult. He even has what he calls his uncle, who is sort of his faith religious
power
guru, that kind of learns from. But just taking the idea of what we could call kind of cult mentality or cult of personality, looking at it from relationship perspectives, it could be personal relationships, work relationships. How did the whole cult idea, what did you see? And from a counseling perspective, what were some of the warning signs or things maybe you recognize because you've seen them in actual victims?
My personal perspective on Doc was he was a cult leader. He
Mhm.
was a maybe a human trafficker in a sense.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, he had these women come to his reserve at a very early age, and these women work there 12 days, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. He had them change their names and bow down to his needs, whether it be sexually, you know, financially, emotionally. And he would take turns with these women. And that is some of the behaviors that human traffickers portray, you know, in their relationships when they bring people in. um so it was kind of scary, you know, as I'm looking more into this, as I'm watching Doc's behavior, and it was that narcissistic behavior again. Everybody's going to bow down to me because I bring my cats out to Hollywood, and we do movies and everything, and I'm the better zoo provider than Joe Exotic or Carol Baskin because my cats have been in Hollywood movies. So everything that I do is going to be better than them.
Yeah.
And that's
And
narcissistic right there.
yeah, absolutely. And it's if there was just taking the dynamic of a workplace, let's call it's Tigers. I have written down what Tigers actually stands for. It's the Institute for Greatly Endangered and Rare Species. Okay, so Tigers. If there was what I would consider, I guess, from an awareness, from a healthy relationship standpoint, yeah, if he is the founder of this refuge, if he is the founder of this zoo, if he is getting these cats and these animals and these creatures into movies like the Ace Ventura movies or in the Britney Spears videos and things like that, he is all the while also recognizing I can't do this without my workers. If they don't do what they do, I'm not me. So yeah, I'm going to give them opportunity to be a part of this. I'm going to do what I can for them. But if I don't show them the mutual respect, then they're not going to do a good job for me, and that makes me look bad. So I got to be there for them as much as they are there for me. Now that does not exist at all in this dynamic. It is they're there to serve his purpose and his goal. And
It was kind of like a labor camp in a sense, because he was only giving these women like $150 a week
mhm.
for their time and their energy, for being there. I think he thought, well, I provide you with food and housing. What more could you want?
Mm-hmm.
With these exotic cats, what would anybody else want in their life?
Mm-hmm. And that's something else. Almost all of the people that you see that are, when you look at this a few times and you take away the main players, so we take away Joe, we take away Doc, we take away Carol, you're left with these workers. You're left with workers, or if they call themselves volunteers, or however you want to define them, that it for them is about the cats. This is their opportunity. Going back to what was mentioned before, Saf, when he has his arm ripped off, he could have had the ability to go through some rehab and physical therapy and some reconstructive surgery and keep his arm, or have it amputated, and basically he's back to work 5 days later, 5 or 7 days later total, and
Right.
is not doing it for anything other than for the cats, and this is my job and this is what I do. I suppose one could kind of argue
But was
there's
he also looking at the point where am I gonna go? I have one arm now. I've been living at this zoo for how many months, how many years? I've been
wow.
here. They had commitment there. Maybe not so much to Joe, but to the cats. So who's gonna take me? I'm part of the LGBT community. People are shunned in that community.
Mhm.
You know, now I'm disabled. So who's going to take me as an employee? So maybe some of those thoughts were brought out too.
Wow, you know, I didn't even really think about that because again, I am as the bystander, so I'm only getting the perspective that Saf presents, and honestly, that's Saf talking about kind of after the fact. And sometimes we might even make a decision for one reason, but then depending on how that decision works out, how the decision and the choice that we make works out, then we in our own mind and how we present it to other people changes. But yeah, there's something to be said there about the fact that there probably wasn't a whole lot of opportunity other than Saf doing what Saf could do to get back to work, because at least it's work. At least it's something. It's a place to live. It's something to do. And then you just kind of put into yourself the benefits that you also get out of it too. And we see this a lot of times. I think you see it in unhealthy relationships is as long as you can find something that you feel you're getting out of it, it really is tough for you to recognize an unfair or an imbalanced relationship or even an unhealthy or a toxic relationship. It's one of the reasons
Right.
why you mentioned trafficking. Wow. And that's something else I didn't even think of. Because I think I find it kind of falls sometimes into the trap of recognizing trafficking by the default of sex trafficking. And when you said Doc Antle being a human trafficker, I'm like, well, he didn't have any of his quote, you know, his women partners, his life partners, he didn't have them engaging in sex for any exchange for anything, but he sure as heck had them working for no pay, basically.
Exactly.
So it's
Exactly.
labor trafficking, and I forgot about that, and that absolutely is. But you know what? For so many of the people there, when they first get there, they're getting something out of it emotionally, and because of that, what you might even call like the honeymoon stage. A lot of those
Yeah.
are going through like a honeymoon stage. So they don't see the imbalance, they don't see the exploitation. They see they're getting something out of it. So how could they possibly be the victim?
They're getting that affection from those cats that normally they probably wouldn't get from a human interaction.
Mm-hmm. And there's
That companionship from those, they're taking these baby tigers and they're, you know, growing with them in a relationship,
mm-hmm.
and they're not getting any other type of human interaction in a relationship. So when something like Saf, when he gets his arm taken off, that's the only relationship that maybe he knows at this point in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And the financial gain, maybe working for $150 or $100, however how much Joe gave him every week to work on the zoo, that was his means of providing for himself. And when
Right.
it comes to relationships, that is the big thing with people leaving, is that financial commitment. Do I have enough money to live on my own if I leave this relationship? And maybe Saf did not have that at the time.
It's a very valid, good point. And just to kind of tie into that, Joe Exotic at his zoo, he's got Seth, as we mentioned, who's one of the keepers. He has, who are some of the people he has working with him? I have them written down here. So he has Eric Cowie, the head keeper. He has John Rinke, the manager. Now we mentioned Saf loses his arm via an accident with one of the tigers. John Rinke, I believe, is the manager who is on he's on prosthetic legs because he was in a zip lining accident.
Right.
And went back to work and just was like, well, I got to rebuild the muscle. I'll walk around, and ultimately wound up having to lose his legs. But both John Rinke, Eric Cowie, those were people that Joe found that were desperate and needed something, and he gave that to them. And honestly, he does the same thing with his partners, John and Travis. I think
Right.
he mentioned that Travis, he found at a bus stop, was just looking for an opportunity or whatever. So
Mm-hmm.
there is a real
There was this, you know, as he described Travis, a 6'6", dark complex young man that was just kind of floating through life at age 19, trying to figure out himself.
mm-hmm.
Joe brought him into the zoo and said, "Hey, come on in. We got a place for you. I need workers." Yeah, he needs workers for Joe's benefit.
Right. And just getting into, again, the unhealthy sort of aspects and what we might even call sort of like the toxic relationships of, you know, the nature of that. you're going to find out later on that there may be a possibility, and we'll kind of save this for later episodes because they don't really talk about episode 1 and 2, but there may be some substance abuse that is being used to kind of keep control over at least one of the people in the relationship. And
Right.
we see this a lot of times in abusive relationships is some form of substance abuse is used to keep the person in the relationship, almost like in a fog. But
Right.
so Joe does definitely have, he's barely feeding these people. And one of the things they showed, it's chilling for lack of a better term. These are his workers. These are, human beings, regardless of how you feel of human beings versus animals. But at one point he explains that one of the ways he helps feed the animals, because it's an extreme cost to feed these tigers, is he gets expired meat donated to him from like Walmarts and big supermarkets, because certain supermarkets have policies that like once meat is brought off a counter, like if you, as he explains, if you go up to the cash register and you go to pay for it and you can't, some stores, you can't take that meat and put it back on the shelf. It has to go as waste because it's been
Right. They consider it to be tainted.
Right. But if you don't mind, you can do whatever you want with it. So they get trucks full of these meats brought in. He lets the workers go through the meats first and pick the meat and stuff they want before he gives the other meat to the animals. So just think about that. Food that a supermarket considers unfit to go back on the shelves and be sold to human beings is being given to an animal refuge, but Joe Exotic thinks he's doing his employees a favor by letting them get to the meat first.
So more or less, he's
Love it.
letting his employees pick out of the garbage for food.
And just to show you
Another
that
explanation there. Yeah.
and even John's like, oh hell, this is still frozen, this is still okay, this is still good. Like, dude, that's, you legally, a store would not be allowed to sell that.
Right. Right.
So again, but at this point it's almost played for laughs and joking, because as they're talking about it, none of the workers are really complaining or feeling emotionally negative towards the situation. They're laughing about it because they're kind of used to it. They're numbed to it, so we treat it as numb. Whereas we're being presented to Doc Antel, who even Joe refers to as his mentor. And you talk about the cult personality, Joe even mentions, I have 2 husbands, he has 5 wives. Are we in a competition? And it's just that mentality, again, an idea of, you might even call it sort of a form of toxic masculinity that Joe did, even identifying as homosexual, is to an extent engaging in. But one of the characters, I keep saying the characters, these are real life people for crying out loud, but this is the effect the show has. But one of the people that we meet is a woman named Barbara Fisher. She's living in Ames, Iowa, but she was one of the former women that worked at Doc Antel's refuge at his zoo. And we kind of get a peek behind a curtain about what he did. He found her when she was young. She was going to be a volunteer. He brought her in, basically did the classic cult behavior. You can leave anytime you want, but can you really? Like you mentioned with the example of Seth, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? Once I know
Right.
I have you, then I can kind of make you do what I want you to do. But as long as you feel like you're still getting something out of it, you're not going to identify yourself as a victim, and therefore you're not going to leave. He made her change her name to Bala. He encouraged her to get implants, which she actually said at the time she was glad because it meant she could take a week off of work, because she needed to recover medically from the procedure. So what was your take on that whole situation?
She never really said why she definitely left the zoo. She never really got into it. She only talked about Doc and her relationship there, but she never actually said why she left.
Yeah.
I found that to be interesting. Was she happy there? Yeah, I think at one point she was happy there, and then it got to a point where she wanted more out of life, and that's what happens in relationships. People want more out of life, and she said, "I had enough."
Mm-hmm.
Maybe him saying, "Well, you have to get these implants in order to stay." And maybe she felt that, okay, I'll stay, I'll get this done, I'll rest a little. And maybe during that period where she was resting, it kind of cleared her mind a little bit. Hey, I don't want this life anymore. You know?
Yeah, and what you learn from like a prevention and an education standpoint, and surely I'm sure you see it as well for counseling, is we get all the questions all the time. Why did they stay? Why did they stay? Why did you all of a sudden? Sometimes there's just not really an explanation. Not anything you can really pin, put a finger on or whatever. It's just like a moment of clarity, or something happens that even the person themselves can never really necessarily be sure. Okay, this is why it happened. This is that moment. This is when I decided enough was enough. It could also simply be the documentarian, the person that's presenting their side of the story, or the show to us, this series to us, didn't really want us to sympathize with her too much.
Right.
Want
Right.
to necessarily know why or whatever, or maybe just felt the reason wasn't good enough or wasn't going to be interesting enough.
And it could go back to that financial situation too. Maybe she stayed in that relationship because of financial reasons, and maybe something came up in her personal life that led her to be able to go back home to Iowa, because she was being interviewed in a home. Maybe a family member, somebody had left her a home to go back to, and she probably said to her family, I'm not happy here anymore. I want to leave, and just different ideas how her life could have rolled out, and why she left that zoo with Doc.
And again, Doc, I think the overwhelming majority of people as bystanders, as viewers of the show, engaging, if you want to, in this relationship between us and the documentarian and the presenting of the story, I should say, Doc definitely comes across. This guy names himself Mahama Yavi Bhagavan Doc Antle. None of those are his real name. His real name's Kevin. We only see that his real name is Kevin when Carol Baskin, because she's, quote, obsessed with shutting down Doc Antle too, she pulls a legal document that has his, quote, real name on it, Kevin. But his real name is Kevin. Regardless of how you feel about that, all of that, the names, the manipulation, calling the episode cult of personality is putting in perspective. This person is a manipulator. This person is a showman. The documentarian films it to be that way too. One of the things I found very interesting is when we as bystanders are first introduced to Doc, and the documentarian is basically like saying, here, let me introduce you to Doc. What happens is he shows up and he tells the filmmakers, this is what we're going to do. I'll go into the house. I'll come to the front door. You come to the front door. I'll open the door and we'll do the introduction there and everything. And as they're walking up to the door, the one camera guy goes, man, this guy's a better producer than us. And then scene, and then he does it again where he's like, well, do you want me to be on the couch? How do you want to set up this scene? There's another scene where he makes this very profound statement. He's talking about, no, I am not a cult. This is a utopia. All these people believe in what we're doing. This is a chance for them to live out their dreams and their desires, and they couldn't be happier. What the documentarian does in that situation is he keeps rolling the camera at the end. So you see him finish his thought, grab a drink and take a drink like, okay, well, I'm done quoting my line. I'm done saying my line. And then the camera actually pulls away from him. And what that does to you as the bystander is it puts you in the perspective of, I'm watching an actor here. I'm not watching Doc Antle, the person. I'm watching Doc Antle, the character.
He wants to perform for the audience.
Right. And so we as bystanders are being manipulated by the documentarian to feel a particular way about Doc. And I can just tell you personally, not from a counseling standpoint, but being acquaintances and friends and bystanders of people that have been in abusive relationships, when the person that is not the abuser, but we might call the victim, or the person that's in the imbalance, the weaker, I'm sorry, I hate to use that term, but the person that is being taken advantage of, we almost get gaslit as the acquaintances, because once they do something, once they get upset or whatever, then the person is going, look, see, there they go. See, look at the way they're behaving. Look at the way they're acting. And that's exactly what the documentarian does by letting us not only see what Doc wants us to see, but the setup to it, because then it makes it look artificial. It makes it look like he's a manipulator and he's a showman. And this is stuff that friends and acquaintances, when they're experiencing people that are having relationships, you can't help but get your feelings of the relationship based on how the people in the relationship are presenting it.
Correct. And he showed total control of the producers of this documentary. You're going to do it my way. He's a natural performer. Natural performers are controlling. They're narcissistic. So he wanted everybody to look at him, look at me, but in a different aspect than Joe, though. You know, Doc was, look at me. I have all these wonderful women. I have all these wonderful cats. And Joe wanted to be famous, and Doc was already famous.
Yeah. Doc, to an extent, even kind of
jealousy there.
Joe.
Right.
And there's another character that just kind of briefly gets brought up. He's sort of ancillary. I keep saying character, my goodness. Another person that we get introduced to that's sort of ancillary is a gentleman named Tim Stark, who runs this sanctuary called Wildlife in Need. And he is, the only way I can describe him, if you haven't seen the show, is he's Ted Nugent, if you know who Ted Nugent is.
Yes.
The ultimate, quote, alpha, macho male and everything. And to the point that when he talks about Doc Antle, he says, well, Doc Antle was my mentor too. He says, but I wasn't as concerned and I wasn't as interested as much as the way he was controlling those cats, those tigers. I wanted to know how he controlled them women. How do I survive women like that? How do I get women in my life to obey me? And that's how we get Doc Antle presented to us. And
there's that jealousy, that envy. I want something that you have. How do I get it?
Yeah. And just to kind of wrap up here, which I think is the perfect sort of wrap up, the last episode really starts to set up talking about who Carol Baskin is and some of the background and identifying her more as a person. But she as well is running sort of a cult mentality. She doesn't even call them workers. That's the first thing you do if you want to.
I think, doesn't she use the term interns?
She calls them interns and volunteers.
Yeah.
You go, well, that's unfair labor practices. No, if it's a volunteer, if they're a volunteer, most of the times when we hear the word volunteer, we just automatically assume as a bystander that it's not paid. It's volunteer doing it because you want to. But she has this level of status and build up to, which is very common in cult mentalities. It's also very common in unhealthy relationships, is you always got to give them something to stay in. If you give them something to want and to go for more, again, they're probably not going to identify as victims because there's something they still want. And if I'm getting something I, quote, want out of you, how can I be the victim? And that's the manipulation that happens. But she does, and you mentioned, she does kind of play into at least the way the documentarian presents to us. She does try to hold herself out, even though you have these two heavy hitters, these two power guys in the world of big cats, Joe Exotic and Doc Antle, saying that she's coming after us, we're the victims. She turns right around and says, well, they don't really get into Doc Antle. I think he just kind of is like, whatever. He sort of laughs her off.
Yeah, because he feels, I'm the superior, I'm the lord of the tiger community.
Yeah, he's got his own world. He's doing movies and stuff like that. In other words, he's not really getting hurt by her. He just kind of laughs her off. Joe doesn't necessarily, quote, have that luxury. If she sues him for money and wins, spoiler alert, she does, he's pretty much handcuffed and he's going to be hurting big time. But she as well holds herself to be a victim. And especially in the case of Joe Exotic, I mean, he is literally making videos and blowing up dummies and talking about killing her and everything. At one point, he mentions that he rents a helicopter to fly over her refuge to see if any exploitation or any unfair practices are going on. And he jokes to one of his partners, John, he says, I should just be dropping grenades right now. I should just be dropping grenades on them. Which again, there's cats out there too. If you love cats, you're going to kill the cats too.
Can we look at the helicopter ride as being having stalking behaviors?
Absolutely. He sneaks in there to try to see if he can find anything going on. And you see that obviously in unfair unhealthy, toxic relationships too, is the obsession is on there, and you got to know you justify it however you want. But yeah, he has a real unhealthy sort of dynamic with Carol. But one of the things that
It's his obsession, like his tigers.
Mhm.
Carol, miserable is an obsession for him.
Absolutely.
And he wants to do it on a daily basis.
You know, one almost wonders. I said to my wife, and we'll just kind of wrap up here. I said to my wife, you know, if all of a sudden Carol Baskin didn't exist, what would this guy have done? If all this and she just like disappeared or went away, he's still going to have all the same problems he has within his zoo. All of his issues and all of his situations are still the same. But now what do you do? And one of the things I think also to just kind of tie in is, as a identified heterosexual male, a lot of prevention and awareness I try to do is identifying the idea of toxic masculinity, and it is throughout this this series. But I think it's important to first understand that, like, when we talk about toxic masculinity, one of the first things that I think a lot of people that aren't familiar with it think, or they just default say that, well, being masculine is toxic. That's not what it means. There's nothing toxic or unhealthy in being masculine. It's the idea that there's certain aspects of what we've defined as a general culture, as a general population sometimes, as masculine, are toxic, or they are poisonous, and they aren't healthy for the person identifying as masculine or the people around them. Now, Joe Exotic identifies himself as homosexual. Most people would go, well, you don't have to worry about toxic masculinity there. No,
you absolutely do have to worry about it.
He absolutely manipulates his partners. He forces two individuals, John and Travis, to become a relationship basically kind of by proxy with each other because he wants both of them. He manipulates them for whatever he wants to do. He manipulates those cats to whatever he wants to do. He's got a problem with Carol Baskin. How's he going to handle it? Doc Antel, he has his toxic masculinity aspects too. But when it came to dealing with Carol, he laughs her off. He moves the other way. He just deals with it the way he's going to. He's going to run his show his way. And if Carol like sues him, he'll deal with it or whatever. Joe, destroy, seek, kill, blow it up, bang, 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 die. And not only
his dealing with her is through violence.
Yeah, not only is that toxic to her, but look at where he winds up. Facing 79 years, doing 22.
Right.
Now, there's nothing to say that it's not, you know, if you want to be, physical and strong, that's fine. But when you're doing it at the exploitation of other people, that's when we get into the idea of toxic. And you had the toxic masculinity as well with, obviously, Doc. The women in his life are subservient. He describes them in the same way he describes the cats. They are the decorations. They're there to serve him. And that is toxic. There's not, again, as I mentioned, earlier, there's not that idea that, yeah, I'm getting something from them, but I wouldn't be anything without them. And so there is that balance. No, it's he and Joe are in the same way. Me. Now, what's very interesting is there's another aspect of toxic masculinity that gets into in the later episodes, and that is the missing husband of Carol.
Yeah. And don't do a spoiler alert, though. We'll
get into that. This is a tasty little teaser for the next one of these that we do, ideally, hopefully, knock on wood. But you leave episode 2 thinking, wow, Carol Baskin is something. She's a manipulator. She's playing the victim. But when you get, and the documentarian doesn't necessarily do a fair and balanced act in learning the background of Carol as much as he did with Joe, but you maybe start to kind of understand where Carol is coming from when she has problems or at least emotional feelings towards these aspects of toxic masculinity, and ultimately why she kind of feels this victim perspective. So with that, we've been talking really good here, right? A lot of good stuff. Any final little summations you want to do as far as this one and heading into the next one? Anything like, let's say ideally people have watched the episodes, or at least the first 2, they watched this what do you want to give them as just kind of the looking forward to into 3 and 4, and we'll get into that next.
I guess just watching the relationship with Joe and Travis and John, and how Carol's previous relationships have affected her later on in life.
Mm-hmm.
Watch those relationships and how they've changed and why people did the things that they did. I don't want to give any spoiler alerts for that, but there's more things on a personal level for Travis anyways.
Yeah.
What was going on with him? You know, why was he staying there so long? Was it the presence, the drug activity, the LGBTQ relationship? What was it all about, and what led him to do certain things in his life? And Carol herself, she came from a domestic violence relationship at a very early age. She came out and said that she was sexually assaulted at a very early age. How does that affect people as an adult? Did they not deal with that at the initial assault? And she came out and said, no, they did not. My family did not believe me. And that is something that we see way too often with young sexual assault victims, is that the family, the guardian, whoever is responsible for that child, they don't want to believe that victim.
Yeah.
That family member, that family friend, whoever, they couldn't have done that.
Mm-hmm.
You know. So I think in the episode 3 and 4, you start to understand what kind of life Carol led up to, and why she's the person that she is at this point. So those are some of the things that I would like the audience to look at, you know, because maybe for a lot that are watching this are thinking, oh my gosh, this happened to me at age 14. My parents, my grandparents, my guardian, whoever was taking care of me, did not believe me. And this really did happen to me. And here I am in my 50s, my 60s, and I'm just now dealing with it. And I had poor relationships all my life. I had poor finances. I couldn't keep a job. I couldn't keep friends. Well, why? Where did that stem from?
And and I think what I would say, just from my aspect, from my side, prevention and awareness and everything, I would say, now that we've kind of talked about things that have been going on, and in particular, the relationship that we're basically having with the documentarian as a bystander, as an observer of these things, I would say go into 3 and 4 and see what you notice as a bystander, as a person observing these relationships. Do you see moments where possible intervention could have occurred? Could situations have been prevented? Were people aware of things that were going on? If they didn't say something, why? If they didn't do something, why? Are you maybe being manipulated? I kind of, I'll just tell you, one of my little selfish things I wanted to do was to set up the things that I kind of noticed that I was being manipulated by, things that I saw the documentarian deliberately doing to try to twist my feelings, because having observed relationships as a bystander, either workplace or intimate relationships among people, watching how people take that bystander, that person, and try to get them, quote, on their side, try to get them to see what they want them to see, the way they talk about the other person in the relationship, the way they set up situations. And unfortunately, one of the other things, getting towards toxic masculinity, I want to bear in mind that one of the other issues, one of the other things that comes through in toxic masculinity, one of the toxic aspects of masculinity, is that you're not allowed to be a victim if you're a man. whether you identify yourself however, whatever form of man or whatever form of masculine, because truly there's all sorts of masculinities, but there are certain things that are toxic in those masculinities. But however you identify yourself as a man, if you identify yourself in any way as a man, you cannot be a victim. And what does that do to the young men in Joe's life? And what does it do to the people that are observing those relationships? In other words, what does the general definition of masculinity and that idea that if you're a man, you can't be a victim, how, whatever type of man you are, how does that play into the other people that are witnessing these unhealthy relationships occur? So,
these are some of the things that we can pick up with our next episode, next podcast.
So yeah, just to wrap up again, ideally what this is going to be is our audio show and everything, and hopefully this will get put up on our the Crime Victim Center Facebook page. And I would like if people listen to this and everything, we're going to take a little bit to see how it works out. I'm going to have to do a little edit and whatever. But ideally, we'll have a little bit of time before we do episodes 3 and 4. If anybody has any questions or things that they notice or things that they want to bring up, maybe after we kind of discuss 3 and 4, we can kind of do like almost like a response to the Q&A on the end, which would be good too, because I think everybody is pulling something out of this. And I know, you and I, we talked about a lot of people were even reluctant to watch it because it's like, oh, that's just silly, that's just goofy or whatever.
Right.
And I can understand that, and I get that, but it's really important to understand that this isn't Breaking Bad. This isn't The Office. These are real people, and even though as I mentioned, they're kind of being filmed, and there's a level of possible artistic, filmmaker license that's being taken. This stuff really happened. We are witnessing these relationships unfold, and it's very much. It speaks to a lot of what we see in our jobs. So yeah.
Right.
All right. Well, man, I want to thank you. This has been awesome, Leslie. So hopefully,
Brian,
you absolutely do this recording the way I want to and sort it out and everything. Worst case scenario, I'll be sending you that awkward message going, oh, by the way, we got to do it all over again. But at least we'll know what to do in the second one. But anyway, thank you so much. Stay safe.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.
All right.